Very good morning to everybody. Privileged to have Kate Nicholls again for, I believe it's her third time on the Leading Through the Revival session. As always, Kate is going to spend approximately 20 minutes just updating everybody on the latest government machinations. There is a Q&A session at the end, so please use the Q&A buttons to put your questions. They will be moderated, but here is your opportunity to ask Kate questions. So here's Kate, refreshed after a holiday in the UK, I'm glad to say, but it wouldn't have been anywhere else. Kate, thank you so much for doing this again. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Danny, and I'm delighted to be able to join you all again as we now are moving back on track with the reopening after having had a slight hiccup around the 1st of August when we had a delay in the reopening of parts of the economy and a sort of bump in the roadmap. So just to pick up what has resumed on the 15th of August and where we are moving forward. And then I also wanted to pick up on quarantine, the next steps on marketing, and also then future priorities moving away from COVID, but also looking at funding the COVID recovery because we're not out of the woods yet. So looking at the sector as a whole, over the 6 to 8 weeks that we've been able to be open, or most of the activities have been able to be open, we now see that we've got about 75% of hospitality fully open, but the sector as a whole is still performing at minus 46% of last year's revenues. So the ones that are open, a game of two halves really, or sort of parson's egg, good in parts. We're seeing strong performance in rural locations, tourism locations, local locations, and also those areas that are sort of suburban. City centres suffering really badly, London in particular, but also Manchester, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Leeds, those sort of large town and cities, lower occupancy and low levels of business on the books for the remainder of the year. And low levels of turnover for those that are open. In contrast, for the sort of tourism side, the rural leisure side, there is a high degree of turnover and occupancy, a good performance based against that restricted occupancy, so much to do to go forward. But the areas that we still need to work on to get open, spas. We have got indoor and outdoor pools, we've got jacuzzis, we've got most now, having had that road bump, most of the spa facial and massage services and close contact services open. We still have a restriction on sauna and steam, and we're working hard to overcome that and to understand why that element has been left behind and what do we need to do to get it reopened and when we can look to reopen it, because they appreciate that not only is that impacting adversely on leisure stay and visitors, but it's also impacting on day spas and the capacity to get those people back in. One thing that has come through when we've looked at the guidance around the reopening of spas and particularly close contact services and facials and eyebrow threading, etc., on the 15th of August, is that there is more latitude and a greater degree of ability for operators to manage their processes and manage their reopening to get potentially more business through the books than they are currently doing. Certainly my experience over the last 2 to 3 weeks, and I hate to do it on anecdotal experience and feedback, but the feedback I'm also getting from the way operators are running is that we've probably gone a little bit further than we needed to in terms of restricting access to those facilities. There are probably more people that could be accommodated in the spa facilities, notwithstanding the fact that most people are doing pre-bookings. And also the government guidance does now actively make clear that changing rooms can be used. The recommendation is still that where possible, people should change in their rooms or change at home, but changing rooms can be used. And my experience so far of being out is that very tight numbers and very tight restrictions and limitation of numbers in pools and spas is being taken forward, and certainly a total ban on use of changing rooms. I think there's more that could be done to accommodate more swimmers, more users, certainly more day spas, but crucially we will try and get that sauna and steam room and that whole thermal experience reopened for you as quickly as possible to understand why that's got caught out. My suspicion is it's just been forgotten about as a sort of hangover, so we're working at pace to try and get that reviewed. But I think my advice to operators would be go back now, review that guidance, double check as to whether you could do more within the space and facilities you've got available to you and the activities, and certainly review that changing rooms point. Second area is around meetings and events, up to 30 people. For weddings, that's resumed from the 15th of August. Meetings and business meetings, we've had clarity that those can be catered. They can be providing food and drink. The recommendation in guidance is that that is not a prolonged exposure or a prolonged period of time, and there is a clear restriction on private functions. So the idea that the weddings exemption for 30 people for a sit-down meal gives you the ability to take bookings for private functions or slip them in under the business events, they should not be catered for. So traditional banqueting is still on pause and on hold, provided we can get through the event pilots. I suspect we will move more rapidly on private functions and small scale functions than we can do on business events and conferences. But for the time being, you should be really cautious about taking bookings for anything that is a private function, and also making sure that you're restricting what you're doing in terms of business events and meetings, notwithstanding the fact that you can cater for them. The reason behind this and the reason for the government's fixation is that the government is now single-minded in getting schools open, and so we have a hump to get over that reopening of schools in September. That is seen as the big key test for the government to manage successfully after the debacles that have happened in education. It also means that the government has this mindset of having an R number or an R budget in place, which is the rate of infection that you're seeing within COVID, and it therefore needs to spend that budget carefully. The health professionals have told them that they are at the maximum that they can do without running a risk of the health infections and the health incidents increasing. And so therefore, when they're focusing on getting schools open, they will not want to simultaneously relax any further restrictions until they've got schools successfully opened, and then they can look at it. And schools and universities is the first big test of bringing people from a more geographically diverse area together in close proximity for prolonged periods of time, and then sending them back out into their own communities, which is why there is this restriction on private functions, banqueting and business events. So that's the next phase. Looking ahead to 1st of October is the provisional date for business events, functions, conference and banqueting to resume. We don't know yet any numbers that might come out of that, but the government is working with the industry and with UKHospitality on some small scale pilots, looking at conferences, exhibitions, awards dinners, private functions and banqueting, sort of up to 500, how that could be managed, so that we can look at the plan and understand the steps that might be taken to allow that business to continue in Q4, and crucially to protect that vital Christmas and New Year's Eve trade that comes through that will be helpful for people. In the intervening period, the government is reinforcing that 2 households rule, and you might have noticed when they confirmed that reopenings could resume as planned on the 15th of August for all those services, and restated the date for business events of 1st of October, they also toughened up enforcement powers. So they toughened them up in a couple of key areas that are relevant for the hotel sector. One is around customer use of masks. And it's a reminder that the guidance that was there for hotels previously about recommending guests wore masks in public corridors and public places outside bars and restaurants, that is now mandatory for guests to wear masks. Fines have been increased. Now, you are not expected to enforce that as an operator, but you might want to reflect that in your signage and in your messaging to your guests, and in any explanations that you are now providing when guests check in or in advance of check-in. The second is around track and trace, and making sure you've got contact details for people, particularly pertinent for those who are booking to come to restaurants or bars who are non-resident and where you don't have a lead booker detail, but the government is stepping up that activity too, and I'll come back to that. And then finally, the 2 household rule. The guidance has changed there to create a new requirement for businesses to take steps to make sure they do not inadvertently facilitate a breach of that rule. Now, the primary responsibility, again, rests with the guests. You are not expected to sort of double check who's booking multiple rooms and whether you've got multiple families and multiple households coming to stay at the hotel and eating and drinking together, but you do need to take steps to make sure that you're not inadvertently facilitating breaches. The suggestion from the government there is that you have notices about it, that more than 2 households will not be seated together at one table, and that you should have a verbal check, particularly again if you're taking bookings or reservations from non-residents, that they are just from 2 households plus a bubble. So those are the key changes that took effect from the 15th of August that are particularly pertinent for the hotel sector. Just on that track and trace, we are expecting that the government's new app that will allow businesses to have their own individual QR code to allow people to check in, again, really relevant for your non-resident guests. You will be able to apply for that, and that app is due to come out within the next few weeks. It's being tested at the moment. You will be able to apply for multiple codes for multiple parts of the hotel. So you will be able to isolate that spa area so that guests just coming in to use the spa will not be contacted or not be caught up in track and trace if you have a hotel guest who's only used the restaurant or only used the rooms that has a case of positive COVID. Also critical then for managing your teams, so you keep those teams in a bubble and you're not having to isolate team members who may come into contact with a potential positive case. Excuse me. So we'll provide more information on that when it comes through, but that will be really useful to be able to have a QR code to scan for the spa, for the restaurant, for non-resident facilities, to supplement what you're doing on track and trace with your lead booker details for people who are staying at the hotel, and also to protect your staff. Final few points for me in terms of next steps of lobbying and the key areas that we are continuing to focus on. We are really concerned and are pushing the government hard about what is happening in city centres and the very low level of footfall, occupancy and revenue that those businesses are generating, and the need for additional support for those businesses, as well as for the full service hotels that are very dependent upon events income. And clearly we are staring down the barrel of a gun with furlough coming to an end. So we are talking to the government about targeted, extended furlough support for those businesses who have not been able to fully reopen their facilities because they've been restricted by legislation, and to provide support to the city centre hotels in particular, as well as the event side. We're also talking about rent support, extension of business rates, holidays for hospitality, and extension of the VAT holiday and loan, as well as extension of the VAT cut to provide that targeted support to the businesses. We're feeding that in ahead of the autumn statement to see if we can get some additional support for those businesses that are adversely affected, and also making sure that we've got a government plan for return to work for cities, and more particularly for London, where problems are acute, where you've got that triple whammy of no foreign tourists, no business activity and business events, and also no return of commuters anytime soon. So those are the areas that we are still looking at dealing with the government about. Some final points. We're looking at the Kickstart programme and the job retention bonus, which you remember kicks in January. Provided you have kept people in employment or on the books, earning a minimum level of about £500 a month, and we're looking to see if that can be averaged over the 3-month period, you will be able to get a bonus for bringing back those workers of £1,000 per worker. That's anybody who's returned from furlough since furlough began in sort of April. Anybody you've brought back at whatever level, provided there is that minimum level between November and January, then you'll get £1,000. So for planning and making sure you've got that written into your cash flow coming through. We're talking then about the Kickstart bonuses that people will get for traineeships, how we can work with Springboard and others in the sector to have a dedicated hospitality traineeship program leading into apprenticeships, using some of that CGRS bonus for those who are concerned about taking more money from government. There is a sort of residual concern about corporate reputation, about companies taking a bonus for people they've already brought back. We're working with government to make that a seamless hospitality package so we don't lose the talent from the industry, and also that we can recruit new talent in from those sectors of the economy that are struggling, most notably retail. And as part of that, we're working with them to support the hoteliers charter to make sure we've got a very positive message about how hoteliers provide high standards of training, personal development, support their staff, and are a badge of good employment practice. Final couple of points from me in terms of quarantine, and then looking ahead to sort of domestic marketing of tourism, and trying to extend the shoulder period and the season. On quarantine, we are still continuing to have dialogue with government. I appreciate that for some businesses, quarantine and restricting foreign tourists coming in is a double-edged sword. It's good for some, in encouraging people to do staycations. It's bad for others because you don't get the foreign tourists. We are continuing to have the 2 weekly assessments. Those assessments will be made on the number of cases that are coming through, new cases that are coming through in a country, as well as an assessment of cases per 100,000 population. Just to give you a sort of comparison, when the French restrictions were put in place, France was having about 97 new cases per 100,000. London was having 2 cases per 100,000, and the UK as a whole was at about 40 to 50 cases per 100,000. So, you know, that gives you an indication of the rates of infection that they're looking at, the reasons why they're doing it. And there will be weekly submissions and fortnightly submissions to ministers so that you can be aware of the timetable of activity. The scientific community will report into government on a Wednesday. There will be announcements if there are any changes on a Thursday, and they will take effect if it's negative, in the same way that it was with France of taking somebody off the safe corridor. That will take effect at 4 a.m. on a Saturday morning. If it's positive and we're reinstating a safe travel country and a safe travel corridor, that will take effect from the following Tuesday. So you can plan those activities. Worthwhile making sure you've got conversations going through with your staff, so that they know what to expect if they are choosing to take holiday now and they are planning to go abroad. The government has put out new guidance for employers and employees, highlighting that the employee bears the burden of risk of choosing to go ahead with a holiday, and recommending that they should be talking to their employer about what happens. They should be actively looking then at resolutions and have plans in place for what they should do if they are caught short, are abroad, and quarantine changes for them. The recommendation from government is that where possible, work from home as normal. Secondly, take additional paid leave that is due to you. And thirdly, unpaid leave if there is no other way around it. Worth making sure that your employees are also aware that now the government has agreed that at the same time that quarantine rule change, the Foreign Office rules will change about non-essential travel. So if the current cases, the current countries that are being looked at that are at risk are Croatia, Greece and Turkey. If somebody is abroad and the rule changes and Greece is taken off the safe travel corridor and they're required to self-isolate, for anybody who books and goes and travels abroad after that, unless they've got very specialist insurance, their travel insurance will no longer cover them, because the FCO travel advice will be do not travel to Greece unless it's for essential travel. So worth making sure you have that dialogue with your teams. Final point then, we had discussions earlier this week with Visit Britain about their autumn-winter campaign to encourage domestic demand. It's focused around short bookings, short breaks, and leading up to the October half term, encouraging people to book a staycation, to think about travelling abroad. The strapline is around Escape the Everyday, and they are going to provide white label materials that hoteliers can use themselves, or DMOs can use themselves. Escape to ... this autumn. We'll provide links once it's available to all of that corporate material that's available. We're recommending that they do a strong push on city centres and London and culture, rather than the current focus that they had been, which was all outdoors, was all rural, was all leisure. That's great, but we also need to be promoting the city centres and particularly promoting London. So more details will be coming through from that. They are expecting that that will go live early September to encourage bookings all the way through to the end of the year, and it will be exclusively at domestic audiences, looking at a media partnership with Channel 4. So you should see quite a lot of material coming out that will be talking about Escape the Everyday, Escape to a British location this autumn. That's all of my update. I'm happy to move to questions. I can see already on the chat we've got lots of questions and answers, so look forward to answering as many of those as we possibly can.
Thanks, Kate. As always, the volume of questions shows how interesting a subject this is. I have one on the wedding market. Given the general feeling on the wedding sector being left behind and venues are now going into administration at an alarming rate, what is UK Hospitality doing to represent the wedding sector? And then piggybacking on that is, would the UK Hospitality promote the legislation gatherings can go ahead for more than 30 people, provided venues have completed the risk assessments, adhere to HS laws?
Okay, thank you for that. Yes, we are actively involved in discussing the wedding sector. I think it's not just weddings, it's also events, and the two are tied together, but appreciate that the wedding sector is unique because it is so much more seasonal. We have been involved in the dialogue with the business department, which looks after weddings, and DCMS, which looks after hotels. That is part of the pilot. And it's being actively looked at this month and into early September. My feeling is that the government is not going to move to increase the numbers at a wedding and increase the size and scope until you get to the 1st of October. I think it's highly unlikely that you will see larger weddings being able to go ahead. It is not a question to do with the size, space, and COVID secure procedures of the venues themselves. The government acknowledges that more can be done. What the reason that they've got the 30 people limit and the restrictions in place, and they've only made that 30 people limit available to weddings rather than other functions, is it's the geographical spread of the people who attend, and the fact that you have lots of people coming into one place and then going back out to lots of diverse communities, and it's multi-generational. That is what is driving the spread of infection. That type of event, that type of audience is driving the level of infection in parts of the country that are under special measures, and that's what's driving the restriction on the number of people that are participating in weddings. So yes, we are working really hard to make sure that the wedding sector is not being left behind, that venues can reopen, that we can have larger weddings from the 1st of October. And we're also trying to get some additional help and support financially for those businesses that are left behind in terms of reopening dates. So whether that's, as I say, extended furlough for those people, or a contribution, a grant, particularly to those venues that are now unable to reopen fully.
And what's your sense on the 1st of October? Is it likely it's going to be increased?
I think it is likely that it's going to be increased. The question then is does that 1st of October date hold, or do we see slippage as we did with the 1st of August to the middle of August, depending on what's happening? It will depend very much on what's happening with the level of infection that we see coming through from children going back to school, which is why I don't think we'll see anything brought forward from the 1st of October. It will increase, but we don't know yet whether it's increase and there's no limit, or whether there becomes a cap and it's a bigger cap. I think you are likely to see weddings being increased, provided the venue can cope with it, and then the cap will be more what the venue can cope with, whether that's weddings or events or private functions. them to make it COVID secure and to make sure you've got 2 households at a table at any one time, rather than there being a move to say now you can have events of 100 or 500, for example. I think that's more likely to move to whatever you feel you self-assess.
There's a couple of specific questions, one around wakes. So you're talking about the private dining. Where do wakes fit into this? I think a lot of hoteliers are running it as a wedding function.
Yes, technically, no, you're not supposed to. It is just weddings. We are seeking urgent clarification because originally they had said weddings or life events. They're now potentially rowing back on that. So I'll get further clarification. I think, you know, at the moment you should be okay because you could treat it as a business event. You could treat it as a function like a wedding. You're not staying there for vast lengths of time. And that should be your check. Just make sure you've got robust track and trace details to cover those people, but technically not allowed at the moment.
And so the same for private functions, a birthday or it's a 2 house, for clarity, the 2 household rule, and
Yes.
people can't, so they can't use the wedding guidelines.
They can't use the wedding exemption for a wider private function or private dining, and the guidance is categoric on that. Private functions not allowed. You can use your function room as a restaurant, which might seem counterintuitive, but you cannot book in large parties for people who want to do 20 to 30 people for a birthday party. No, the 2 household rule applies, and the more people breach that or push it or try and work around it, the slower it will be to get the rest of the events and functions section open, because it will cloud the issue, and the health lobby will say, well, see, these people can't be trusted, they're not doing the right thing. I'm sure you all saw the wedding that was closed down in Blackburn, 100 people at a wedding in Blackburn in one of the areas that's subject to local controls. That's just going to delay us in getting everything else reopened.
So the message is follow the rules for the greater good.
Follow the rules for the greater good. It gives me greater chance of getting you open quicker.
Great. As you would expect, lots of questions on the so-called bagel effect. So what is the strategy to get people back into city centre offices has come up. And can I add on to that? There's been a couple of questions about airport hotels who feel like they are a forgotten area because that they are severely impacted, obviously due to the flights.
Yes, obviously our top priority is to try to get the government to move towards a much clearer strategy and message about back to work, and that's what we're focused on trying to get from September, that the government guidance changes and that we also have very proactive guidance around use of public transport. It's still too woolly at the moment, and the government deliberately fudged it and said they would leave it to employers to make that decision. This is again, it's tied up with the government's inability to move on from schools and worry about doing more to use up that R budget. You've got the Department for Business and Treasury pushing really hard for a clear back to work strategy, back to the office strategy and message from September. And you've got the Department of Health urging caution and moving that back. So we're raising that, and we will do a CEO's letter to the Cabinet Office and to Number 10 to try and make sure that we can get that message through, and also try and get the additional support for that sector of the economy that is struggling the hardest. I mean, this is not just city centre hotels, it's more widespread than that. But targeted extended furlough would help for the restaurants, the cultural activities. I mean, it's all interlinked. So we're working hard to get that, and we'll add in the airport hotels too.
Thank you. Couple of comments on Eat Out to Help Out being a great initiative. Is it likely to be extended? What are you pushing for in that area?
We're talking to the Treasury to see if they have an appetite, no pun intended, to extend it. At the moment, they are saying that it was just a short, sharp intervention to kickstart demand. It's had that effect. and they point to the VAT cut as an alternative mechanism for operators to pass on price reductions to customers if they want to. At the moment, we're focused on saying if there's unspent funds in that 500 million that was set aside for it, please extend it into September to see if we can help with that return to work message, a boost to the city centres if people do start returning to work.
Okay. A very technical question here. I know you love a good technical question. If I employ someone who was furloughed by another organisation, does £1,000 still apply?
No,
So
you have to have furloughed that person and brought them back. So it is directly related to your decision to retain. So if you've employed them previously, you furloughed them, and then you bring them back, you get it. They can have been furloughed by multiple employers if they had part-time jobs, but the payment of the jobs retention bonus only goes to the person who did the furloughing. So if you had no furlough relationship with that person, you don't get it.
Okay, thank you. Kate, could you just expand the track and trace that you were talking about and different zones of the hotel? Could you explain, A, how people are going to get that communicated to them, and just expand on that a little bit, because I think there's a lack of clarity on what's coming and how it's coming.
Okay, I will do my very best, but it is sort of with limited knowledge of and limited disclosure of what the government is planning. The government is moving towards developing its own track and trace app. This is good news for businesses. It won't remove your obligation to do things, because obviously not every customer that comes in has a smartphone. But for those who do, or for those who are not pre-booked and haven't given you contact details, this is a government app which they are encouraging the population to have on their phone, and it uses Bluetooth technology to ping off the masts that are around, so they will be able to know in greater granular detail when you have spent time with somebody. So rather than being the whole of the hotel restaurant that's covered if one person gets a positive COVID test, this will identify just those people who are in close proximity. So the government app will help for the customers. It will help with the track and trace to narrow it down and reduce the individuals that have to self-isolate. It works on a QR code principle. So for businesses where you are taking walk-in trade, or you don't have that pre-booked information, and it's worthwhile doing it even if you have got that pre-booked information, because it will capture a greater granular detail of where they've been and what the location is, you will get a QR code as a business. And you will have the choice as to whether you have one QR code for the whole of the business, or whether you have multiple QR codes for parts of the business. And my recommendation would be that as hotels, you would want to have multiple QR codes, so that you know and you can restrict the staff who are potentially exposed to a requirement to self-isolate. And in some of the bigger restaurants at the moment where people have had positive cases of COVID, it's meant the closure of the restaurant, because they haven't been able to keep staff in separate bubbles, and all of the staff have had to self-isolate in those cases for 2 weeks. So it's quite a big onerous detail. So the idea will be that when it goes live, the government will set up a website, operators will log in and get a unique QR code for their destination or destinations, which can then be put up on signage at points around the hotel, so that as people move around the hotel, residents and non-residents, they will check in using their smartphone to say that they've gone for a drink in the bar, they've gone into the restaurant, and it will crucially tell how long they've dwelt there. So that if you have a COVID case that's reported in a restaurant at 10 a.m. in the morning, and somebody checks into the restaurant at 3 a.m., they're not affected and they can be excluded. So it's about making sure you've got that granular level of detail. You will get the QR code. The customers will be encouraged to download the app. That means that then the government takes responsibility for the GDPR and the personal data, and will deal with all of that. So it takes a big burden off the businesses for track and trace. That's as much information as I've got at the moment about how it looks as though it would work, but you can see how useful it will be for making sure that you've got protection for your teams. And that's where I think you need to be focusing going forward. as we move into this, and we've got track and trace up and running, we've got the government app, we've got more frequent testing, we've got saliva-based testing, the potential exposure of your teams to a positive test result and a requirement to self-isolate for 14 days is going to be quite dramatic and have a big operational impact on the business. So I think anything you can do to keep teams in bubbles, to minimize exposure, will be helpful, and that's one way of doing it, and that's why I recommend multiple QR codes for different parts of the business. We'll provide more information as soon as we get it, but hopefully that gives a better feel for that aspect.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just going to jump back to weddings. Had a message, Verity Williams doesn't feel we've answered one of the questions, so I'm going to read it out word for word. Would the UK hospitality promote the coronavirus legislation that gatherings can go ahead for more than 30 people, provided venues have completed the risk assessment and adhere to health and safety? In addition, would you help clarify if it is the venue or local authority that can deem them COVID secure, and how would you calculate an acceptable number of people?
Okay, sorry we didn't answer it properly the first time round. I'm seeing if can you just tell me, is that in chat or is that in questions?
That's in questions, the very first question. That's probably me not reading it out.
No, it's quite all right. I'm just making sure, given that we've been challenged on it, I want to make sure that I've got it in front of me now. I've got it in front of me now.
The very first question. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, we are promoting that we should be allowed to have gatherings going ahead of more than 30 people. The question is just on timetable and where the government is on that. So the answer to the first part of the question is yes, we are promoting it. Yes, it is the venue that completes the risk assessment, adheres to health and safety law, self-assesses that they are COVID secure. We've written the UK hospitality guidance to allow people to do that, to make their own judgments about volume and how many people you can fit in. There is additional guidance on business events and functions, which looks at the number of people per square metre, which you might want to have a look at to help you do that. But it's the same process that you would go through for a business event or a meeting or a restaurant to be able to determine how many you can accept. And we would hope that that would be a self-assessment process on numbers post 1st of October. Can we clarify if it's the venue or the local authority that deems them COVID secure? It's the venue that makes their self-assessment. Clearly, the local authority may come and challenge that. But if it's to do with workplaces, it's health and safety executive. Your local EHO is somebody that it would be worthwhile talking to make sure that you've done that assessment of an acceptable number of people. It's not at the moment set out as per square metre or venue capacity. It is just based on size and scale in the same way that you do for restaurants, and it is your own mechanism, so you could use any of those metrics. Have to say that might change as we go through the pilots. That's the purpose of the pilots that are taking place this month that will come out, and it may change and we may have more details going forward ahead of the 1st of October as to how you could do that. But at the moment, my understanding is you can make your assessment as to how many you think you can have in one space, abiding by the COVID secure guidelines of 2 households plus bubble per table, spaces between tables, 2 meters or 1 meter plus with mitigations. So most of the guidance you will need to make that assessment is already out there. Hopefully that provides.
Thank you so much. So changing topics completely, question from Edward Law, who I know has a couple of a number of hotels that rely very heavily on day spa, and I know you addressed it at the beginning, but the question is, how can we get saunas and steam rooms open? The scientific evidence supports reopening, the lower risk profile, industry protocols are in place. What else can we do as an industry? And I know he's been working with the UK Spa Association.
Yes. Yeah, we're working with UK Active, and we're picking up with the UK Spa Association too, to try and understand what is it that's really concerning them about spas, saunas and steam rooms, and how we can overcome that to get that reopen, pushing as hard as we can to get that resolved, and hopefully we'll have an answer by the end of this month.
Thank you. Okay, couple more questions about masks. Just opinion about masks. I thought you were quite clear, but that question is, there is still debate on whether to enforce in the hospitality industry.
Yes, I mean the legislation is quite clear now that it's not our job to enforce it. It is a personal issue, and please always remember that when you're dealing with guests who are not wearing masks, that there are people who are exempt, and may not have the badges or the lanyards to show you that they're exempt. The only times that masks are mandatory in hospitality is public areas of hotels, public corridors, moving around the lobby space. They're not required in the restaurants and bars. So I guess public lounges, if you've got them, where people are using it, but not for coffee. Obviously, if you're going in towards business meetings or you're taking business meetings, it's then up to the people in the meeting room themselves to take that decision as to whether they want to continue with masks or not. But your obligation is not to enforce it. The other area that you've got it, which might apply to some hotel facilities, is takeaways. If you are queuing to go for a takeaway, then you are supposed to have a mask as well. So if you're doing takeaway, grab and go, coffees, etc., that's an area that people will need to be masked, but that's probably also duplicated up by public areas of the hotel. But your staff are not required to enforce it.
Couple of questions around the job retention of £1,000. I think Nicholas Dickinson sums it up well. My understanding of the £1,000 return to work bonus was it was payable in respect of any previous furloughed member of staff who earned at least £520 a month on average, and the on average, and you've kind of implied it might have to be each month.
That's still something that we need to have the detail on as to clarify. The requirement for the payment is November, December, January. That's where the £520 comes in, which is something that is obviously critical for seasonal businesses. And it's just so it's not since they came off furlough, it's just that period of time. We are checking to make sure that holiday pay can be used to cover that. It should be, but we are getting a double check. And we're clarifying about average or whether it is per month. And seasonal businesses, the key point there is if you have staff who you routinely take off the books and then bring them back onto the books, just make sure they're still on the books, and that there's a minimum average payment if you can. But it's only that period of time that it relates to. So it's those 3 months between furlough ending and the payment being made, and we're just clarifying whether it is an average over those periods.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, I think we are running out of time, so can I just say a huge thank you.
Quite all right. Can I just answer Peter Hancock's question?
Yes.
Quick
might have one more after that. Sorry.
That's
so
okay.
Let's go for two more. Sorry.
I've got plenty of time, so I'm quite happy to go through them, depending if you have. Hotels being allowed to hold business meetings for up to 30 people from the 1st of October. The good news is, Peter, they're already allowed to hold business meetings for up to 30 people. So you can do that now, and it's 30 people per meeting room if you've got the size and space. So if you have a large business, you have a large venue that has multiple meeting rooms, you are allowed 30 people per meeting room if you've got the space to accommodate them. And you just need to make sure they're socially distanced within that meeting. So you can do that now, have been able to do it since the end of July.
Okay, thank you. There's an interesting question from Roxanne Marjoram about feasibility of taking group bookings in pubs, restaurants for December. I think historically September has been one of the peak booking periods for Christmas functions.
Yes, it all looks positive that you will be able to do that, turning the entire venue over for exclusive use and having people in restaurants. It does look as though that will be feasible. We should get confirmation of that just before the 1st of October go live date on functions and events. It will be tied up with that. So hopefully we will get an indication in September, which will allow decisions to be made on existing bookings where deposits are held, and taking future bookings. But it is looking positive. And government, more importantly, government is acutely aware that Christmas bookings in the run-up to all through December and New Year's Eve are vital to get the industry onto a good footing for 2021. So they're aware of the seasonality issue there.
Okay, fantastic. And so is October the 1st going to be the next big industry relevant announcement, or do you think there'll be more before that?
There might potentially be some small scale changes if we can get saunas, steam rooms. That wouldn't be a major announcement, but the next big change for the industry will be around business events, functions, conferences, exhibitions, Christmas, and that we would expect in September.
Okay, fantastic. Kate, really appreciate your time once again. Lots of, as always, there's been lots of questions with a prefix of please say what a wonderful job Kate's doing. So thank you very much.
You.
Really appreciate it.